Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about sample surveys and what can go wrong. So the problem with doing these sample surveys is you get to the end, you've asked people what you think or what you think you want to know, and you've got information, and there's always some hole poking that's going to go on, meaning people are going to question how you did it, who you asked, what the questions were, those types of things. And so what we want to do as we enter into this experimental design, observational study design, is we want to try to look ahead and see where are the potential problems with what I'm going to do, and also be able to evaluate different samples that have been done and say what should they have considered when they were doing this. So here we go. As we're looking at these sample surveys, one of the things that can happen is we can have undercoverage. And undercoverage, as the name suggests, is when numbers of the same population cannot or are less likely to be chosen. So you can undercover certain areas of the population. And something important to remember is we want to try to eliminate this because it's people that cannot be chosen or are less likely to be chosen. Cannot be chosen is a little bit sometimes easier to spot than are less likely to be chosen. And so we want to try to eliminate both of those things. Less and so, for example, if we had some sort of survey that was being conducted and people said, okay, what we're going to do is we are going to go to the phone book. We're going to try to look at who exactly is in this area. And we want to ask a random sample of people about their, do they have cable in their house still? And so they call the number that's listed in the telephone book and see what their cable coverage is. So what is a potential source of bias there? Well, does everybody have a landline? That's something important to consider. So, landlines are something in that case that could be considered, a limiting factor and could cause undercoverage. Next piece, and this box is going to be divided into 3 parts. Next part would be non-response bias. So non-response bias is when an individual is selected to be in the samples. You say, you are going to be in this sample. I would like to sample you, but they don't do it. Or, so they might be chosen, they might say, I don't want to do it, or they just aren't reached. So you try to get a hold of them by phone, but you never did. And of note, this is different than voluntary response. This is different than voluntary response because in voluntary response, you're saying, does anybody want to participate? And people may or may not. In this one, you're saying you have been chosen, but the person chooses not to respond. Okay, so it's a little bit different in that way. And the last one is response bias. In a response bias, it would be a pattern of inaccurate responses. Okay, a pattern of inaccurate responses. So what might happen there? So it could be due to like wording of a question, for example. Maybe the wording was particularly confusing the people who are taking the survey didn't take it as you intended. It could be the interviewer. So, for example, if you want to find out what students think about the dress code, for example, and the dean of students who's in charge of enforcing dress code issues is asking, how do you feel about the dress code? Well, students might not be willing to be honest about the dress code because they're talking to the person who is in charge of writing the dress code. And so there's a certain amount of influence from the person who's interviewing that you have to take into account when you're accounting for response bias. Also, if you want to get an idea of how people treat the speed limit. So let's say I called in students and I was like, do you go the speed limit when you're driving to school? Well, they might just lie. They might say, yeah, I do. And I might say, well, all of our students follow the speed limit. So I don't know who these students are that they say in this whatever study that don't follow the speed limit, because it might just be lying, and it might be self-preservation, it might be intimidation, but for whatever reason, people are lying, and that's a big deal in surveys because you have to account for that, and you have to figure out ways to find out the information that you want without incentivizing or at the very least encouraging people to lie. Check your understanding. So again, a good way to do this would be to pause the video here, try to work through these questions and identify the biases that are being shown, but then come back, unpause the video, and look at the answers and see what's going on with them. So I'm going to keep rolling, but if you want to try this on your own and then check your answers, feel free to pause right here. Part A, 1A. The sample is chosen at random from a telephone directory. So what is the possible source of sample bias? Well, like I said up above, this could be undercoverage. And that's because people with numbers are the only people that can be chosen. So anyone from the population that doesn't have their number listed in the directory would not have the chance to be chosen. And so that's one of those ones where they're less likely to be chosen. Or actually, I guess that would be cannot be chosen, not necessarily less likely. So people cannot be contacted within 5 calls. This is non-response. Because some portion of the sample cannot be reached. So they don't respond. Okay, so for whatever reason you can't get a hold of them, that's a source of response, non-response bias. So interviewers choose people walking by on the sidewalk to talk to or interview. So what's the source of bias here? This is just a convenience sample. Why is that a source of bias? Well, all the people on the sidewalk, they have some sort of commonality. So if it's time of day, maybe they're all on lunch break. If it's morning time, it's people who walk to work, something like that. So it's a convenience sample. So all the people they have some commonality. So that's a source of bias because you don't have a well-rounded view of the population from there. All right, number 2. A survey paid for by marketers of disposable diapers found that 84% of the sample opposed banning disposable diapers. So here's the actual question. It is estimated that disposable diapers account for less than 2% of the trash in all today's landfills. In contrast, beverage containers, third-class mail, and yard wastes are estimated to account for 21% of the trash in landfills. Given this, in your opinion, would it be fair to ban disposable diapers? Okay. So, do you think the estimate of 84% is less than, greater than, or about equal to the percent of all people in the population who oppose banning disposable diapers? Explain your reasoning. So, look at the wording of this question. A survey paid for by the makers of disposable diapers found that 84% of the sample opposed banning. Okay, opposed banning. So you have to be careful with this because it thinks that diapers should be allowed to be disposable. And so you kind of got to worry about, look at what the wording is. But at the very least, when you look at the way that this question is framed, it says less than 2% is in today's landfills is from diapers, and 21% of is mail, yard waste, and beverage containers. So they kind of stack the odds here, right? So they say these three things versus this one thing. So it would be that 84% is likely greater. And why? So the wording of the question makes it sound like diapers are not a problem. That they're not a problem in landfills. And so that's the issue is you do all this framing of the question, and then you say, do you think they're a problem? Well, you just told me that they're this tiny percent compared to all of these things that seem like a greater evil in terms of landfill filling, right? So is that fair? Is that fair wording? Well, you have to be aware of that in questions, because that's going to cause bias, because then people, no matter how they feel about diapers, are going to go, oh, well, I didn't know it was that small. And all those other things seem like a bigger deal, so I guess not. So 84% is likely greater than the true percentage of people that seem to think that diapers are a problem, okay? So what did we talk about today? We talked about sample surveys and the bias that can be introduced from various things like undercoverage or non-response bias, response bias. So look for those when you're evaluating surveys and when you're taking surveys and when you're evaluating the results of any surveys that you may be giving. So thanks for watching.